Hello, everyone, and welcome to this ASPI webinar, Hong Kong and Beijing. Why now and what does it mean? Two very good questions. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Kelsey Munro. I'm a Senior Analyst here at ASPI, and I'm really pleased to be able to host this very distinguished panel to discuss this incredibly important issue of Hong Kong today. Look, we're going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have approximately half an hour for questions. From the audience, please send your questions through in the window you should be able to see in your browser. And when we get to the Q&A part of our panel, you can also upvote questions you're particularly interested in. Now, those of us outside Hong Kong have watched with, I think, much admiration and sadness the really extraordinary events that have unfolded in the city, particularly over the past 12 months, as masses of Hong Kongers have taken to the streets to assert their democratic freedoms in the face of increasing repression from Beijing. Personally speaking, the courage and endurance and organisation of these peaceful protesters in this kind of David and Goliath battle have been really incredible to witness. But at the National People's Congress last month, with much of the world still in lockdown due to the coronavirus pandemic, Beijing announced it would bypass the Hong Kong legislature to impose a new national security law in Hong Kong, which would prohibit secession, subversion, foreign interference, and acts of terrorism. And it also specified that China could set up organisations in Hong Kong to oversee national security. The effect of this law would be to, at the least, significantly restrict a range of freedoms and rights that are currently protected under Hong Kong law and have serious impacts on the personal liberties of Hong Kongers. And many have said, despite Beijing and Carrie Lam's insistence otherwise, that it will effectively be the end of the one country, two systems formulation under which the Chinese government agreed with the UK government at the handover in 1997 that Hong Kong would have judicial independence and legislative autonomy from China, at least until 2047. And this move also comes at a time of enormous economic difficulty for Beijing and many countries around the world. So, while it might not be surprising that Beijing has prioritised control and repression in Hong Kong, or stability as they would call it, over the demands of Hong Kong citizens, I think it is very surprising to many that Beijing seems to have calculated that the special political status that has made Hong Kong such an important financial hub and a bridge between East and West, it is surprising that Beijing seems to have decided to sacrifice that with untold economic impacts to come. But as we will hear from our panellists, I think pessimism abounds, but we shouldn't write Hong Kong off just yet. So to discuss this hugely consequential issue and the implications for the rest of the world, let me introduce our panel. Martin Lee is a distinguished barrister and politician who has devoted his life to promoting democracy in Hong Kong. He was involved in drafting Hong Kong's basic law and served as a member of the Legislative Council for many years. He founded the United Democrats and its successor, the Democratic Party. And on the 18th of April this year, with other prominent supporters of democracy, he was arrested and later released on bail on suspicion of unauthorised activity during the 2019-20 pro-democracy protests. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today. And Wang is the Senior China Researcher for the independent NGO Human Rights Watch. She focuses on technology, surveillance, Hong Kong and Xinjiang. There's nothing wrong with your screen. Maya is joining us by audio only. Maya, thanks so much for joining us on the panel. I think you're on mute there, but I think we can hear you in a minute.
Thank you.
There she is. Okay, and Leong is a former long-time Legislative Council member and current chairman of the Civic Party, the second largest political party in the pan-democratic camp. He's a former chairman of the Hong Kong Bar Association and served as the convener of the Pan-Democrats during the 79-day Occupy Umbrella movement in 2014. Alan, welcome. Thank you.
Hi.
And finally, my colleague Michael Shoebridge is the director of ASPI's Defence Strategy and National Security Program, and he's the former deputy of 2 Australian Defence Intelligence Agencies, among other senior government roles. Michael, thanks for joining us too.
Lovely to see you, Kelsey.
Thank you all very much for making the time, and to our audience too. Martin Lee, if I could start with you, assuming Beijing goes ahead with its plans in this national security law, what will it mean for Hong Kong?
Actually, I must take you back to 6 years and 1 day back in history, because on the 10th of June 2014, the Chinese government suddenly published a white paper claiming that the central government has comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong. And they published the document in 7 different languages, as if they were afraid that people won't know. Now, what does that mean? The one country, two systems policy for Hong Kong was described by Deng Xiaoping when he negotiated with Margaret Thatcher back in the early 1980s as China's basic policies regarding Hong Kong, meaning that Hong Kong will continue to be operated as a capitalist system as opposed to mainland China under a socialist system for 50 years, and that our lifestyle will be unchanged. And apart from defense and foreign affairs, which are reserved to the central government, Hong Kong will be given a high degree of autonomy in terms of executive power, legislative power, and judicial power. So what he said, whenever he said one country, two systems, it's always followed by Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy. Now, 6 years and 1 day back, President Xi Jinping replaced that promise with his new idea, his new policy in Hong Kong, which is central government, that means the Chinese Communist Party, ruling Hong Kong with comprehensive jurisdiction. So just the entire opposite. Instead of Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong, it's the Communist Party ruling Hong Kong. And they have comprehensive jurisdiction. That means, in this white paper, even our courts are subject to the supervision of the Chinese government. So what is now happening in Beijing? They are now drafting this draconian law for Hong Kong, which is against the Basic Law. The Basic Law only says that the Hong Kong Legislative Council is given exclusive power to enact laws of Hong Kong or amend or repeal them. The Standing Committee of the National People's Congress has no such power, because although the Chinese Constitution has given it a lot of power, because that's the most important body apart from the National People's Congress itself, the Hong Kong Basic Law governs Hong Kong. So anything to do with Hong Kong, you've got to look at the Basic Law. And they don't have that power at all to legislate for us. So that is why it's so bad. Not only the contents of the law, although we haven't seen it, you can see that it's meant to be bad for us. They want to implement the new policy of having comprehensive jurisdiction over us. That's to say a lot. So we must concentrate on that. Even if, we are lucky, even if they don't enact that law now and say, okay, we'll leave it to the Hong Kong legislature, it's still bad. We must stop them from pursuing this new policy. They are now giving up Deng Xiaoping's one country, two systems. They're telling the whole world that that has failed, right? But we mustn't allow them to walk away from it. Otherwise, even to legislate this one, the Hong Kong legislature can do it for them because Beijing already controls our legislature. It still doesn't have Hong Kong at all. So we must do everything to bring China back to Deng Xiaoping's promise of one country, two systems, Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong with a high degree of autonomy.
Thank you, Martin. Alan, Leong, why do you think Beijing made this move now? I mean, what the timing seems particularly curious. So what triggered it, do you think?
Well, Martin talked about Hong Kong people's expectations when we reverted to Chinese sovereignty on the 1st of July, 1997. But the 23 years that followed from the 1st of July tells a story of treachery and deceit. It seems that by looking back now, what happened in the past 23 years bear witness to the intentions of Beijing and the CCP not to honor its obligations under the Sino-British Joint Declaration and also promises to Hong Kong people under the Basic Law. So maybe Beijing is now thinking that the world, the free world in particular, has been too busy dealing with the coronavirus. And also, it is no longer good for Beijing to try to pull wool over everybody else's eyes. And in any event, the CCP has nothing more to lose. So this time round, they are really taking back Hong Kong nakedly without those obligations contained in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and also without the promises enshrined in the Basic Law, which promise us 50 years unchanged ways of life. Our social institutions will remain the same as before the reversion of sovereignty. All our freedoms, human rights, rule of law, separation of powers, and other social institutions were promised not to be tampered with. But now they want to forego all these promises and come down on Hong Kong like tons of bricks when the free world is too busy minding their own coronavirus issue. Now, it also may have something to do with President Xi Jinping and the CCP being too conceited about their powerfulness. So in a way, they are just very conceited. They believe in their absolute power, and they, concluding from the 20 years from their accession to WTO, and the free world is letting the CCP or the China under CCP to get away with what it has promised upon China's accession to WTO, like a competitive economy, opening up of market, protection of intellectual properties, right, and moving towards respecting human rights, etc. Well, since you have been doing nothing about it, and it seems that you only have the profits to be made in the huge Chinese market in mind, without enforcing and policing compliance with the original idea of getting China under CCP to embrace the rules-based world order. So, so they think, well, maybe they can get away with it this time as well.
But there will certainly be huge economic impacts for Beijing and reputational impacts in terms of how can the rest of the world trust China's word if it won't even stick by its own international agreements on Hong Kong. So, I mean, Michael, what do you think why has this sort of security or political calculus trumped everything else here?
Well, this is an interesting term to use, Kelsey, but my view about this is Hong Kong, Beijing's approach right now with Hong Kong is by no means just about or even centred on Hong Kong. The Communist Party's very poor handling of the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic and the suffering that it inflicted because of that on the people of mainland China and the rest of the world is an enormous anxiety and weakness that the party has, because they failed. And their whole governing compact with the 1.4 billion people in mainland China is that they are the only capable rulers of that 1.4 billion multi-ethnic empire. And Hong Kong is a deeply threatening demonstration that another form of government over a Chinese population can be vibrant and successful. And worst of all, that form of government is a democracy with all of the hallmarks of a vibrant, successful democracy. And we've heard Martin and Ellen talk about them: freedom of speech, rule of law through independent courts, freedom of association and freedom of strike are also explicitly mentioned as continuing freedoms to remain unchanged under the joint declaration that the Chinese government entered with the UK government. So this is a radioactive demonstration that there's another successful system of government for the Chinese people. And as an example to the mainland, It is a radioactive example in Beijing's eyes. So right now, the pandemic is causing enormous economic disruption globally and within China itself. Chinese economic growth has fallen so much that the government won't even set a target. Their consumption is flatlining as you'd expect because no one's out there buying things. Their global export markets are evaporating because of depressed global demand. Right now, you would think Hong Kong's golden goose economic effect, as the front door of foreign investment into China and an economic powerhouse, would be really important to Beijing. But it just tells you that security and the Communist Party's grip on the mainland are such an absolute priority, and there's so much anxiety about them that they're willing to sacrifice the economic benefit of Hong Kong to remove the freedoms and the example it sets for the Chinese people. I think that's the bigger thing that's going on now.
Thanks, Michael. Now, look, I mean, the legacy of the Tiananmen tragedy looms in protesters' minds, I think. I mean, as Martin pointed out, the protests actually started around the annual commemoration of Tiananmen in 1989. But I'm interested, Maya, the Chinese authorities have, I think part of feeding into the pessimism in the Western coverage of the Hong Kong situation is that there's this perception that Beijing has sort of all-powerful surveillance technology and that all the protesters can be identified and sort of rounded up later on. You study the surveillance technology in use in China and in Hong Kong. Can you discuss that a bit and what the key differences are there that you've seen and whether that's true that Beijing's kind of surveillance apparatus is really all-powerful in Hong Kong?
Well, it's right to be pessimistic about Hong Kong, and I think the international community must treat it very seriously. The New York Times China journalist Stephen Lee Myers have used the example of Crimea, Russia's annexation of Crimea, as an example to, it's not a perfect analogy about the situation in Hong Kong, but nonetheless, it's still a major breach of international rule when China basically announced that we're going to assert direct control. So no doubt it is a serious matter, but if you look at how Hong Kong is compared to the rest of China, or that people in Hong Kong is worried about Hong Kong turning into Xinjiang, you see the weakness of the Chinese Communist Party's rule here. The party start out with designing society in ways that they can totally control it. I mean, we talk about surveillance as a means of control, but if you look at how the party controls the country, it is multifaceted and multi-levels. So there's low-tech ways of informants at every level of society and governance. And then there is also the high-tech means that you've seen in the last 20 years. That took 20 years for them to build. Now, we talk about surveillance in terms of targeted surveillance. Targeted surveillance is relatively easy. Martin and Ellen probably are followed by people every day, or in the future it's going to be that kind of targeted surveillance is fairly easy to pull off. Mass surveillance, on the other hand, is a lot harder. And mass surveillance, we can talk about the use of internet surveillance or physical surveillance by the use of collection of biometrics. All of that China has developed. However, in China, there's no law, there's nothing that push against that kind of surveillance. Whereas in Hong Kong, there is the privacy ordinance that requires that when government collects data, that data has to be used only for that purpose and not for anything else. So in order to pull off the kind of China-style surveillance, it would take years to build in Hong Kong, and it would require dramatic changes in Hong Kong legal and regulatory environment that I think it would be challenging for the party. Keep in mind that Hong Kong, unlike Xinjiang, has about, over half of the people who are strongly democratic. So in order to find out who these people are going to be a ginormous task even for the party. And if you look at the party's thinking about Hong Kong right now, it is trying to kind of apply the Xinjiang and Tibet model of security maintenance here, but it's to a dramatically different society altogether, economically and socially. So I think it is not accurate to say, well, this is the death of Hong Kong. It's just the beginning of a much longer and protracted battle over democracy.
Thanks, Maya. Martin, as I mentioned in the introduction, you were among the democracy leaders arrested earlier this year. But I think there have been 8,000, at least, protesters arrested over the course of the movement in the last year or so. How would their fate and yours be affected by the new national security law? Does it change the kind of risk calculus for protesters dramatically?
Well, I don't know, because we are told by some government people here that it is possible that this draconian law they are drafting may be given retrospective effect, in which case Ellen and I would be charged under the new law to be applied back to today. All right. So one doesn't know what this new law will cover, but you can assume that many of our freedoms would be seriously eroded. There's no doubt about it. Close to 9,000 people now have been arrested. I have the honor of being the oldest. I think the youngest is only 11 years old or something.
Yeah, extraordinary.
I think 1,600 of us are now actually before the court, or even more. All right. And so if they prosecute all the 9,000, which I don't think they would, but if they do, we don't have enough prisons to take all of us. And they may follow the Xinjiang example of having concentration camps or something. How do they convert the majority of the Hong Kong people to their way of thinking? Right? This was what I said. They want to do that. How do they go about it? So I remember all these years we've been saying, don't let Hong Kong be turned into just another ordinary Chinese city. But from now on, I don't think Hong Kong will be just another Chinese city. It will be close to Xinjiang. Special city, all right? Special in that way.
Terrifying idea.
If I can just,
just the opposite.
if I could just add something in here, I think a goal of these new laws, and also the arrests and repression of protests that we're seeing before the laws have been enacted that Martin's talking about, one goal is to have more people in Hong Kong support the CCP as the ruler. But I think a more achievable goal for them is to silence large chunks of the Hong Kong population. And this is where I think we've got to make a connection again beyond Hong Kong, because this is the same method. And there are some similar tools and means beyond the sort of de facto control that Beijing can have, that Beijing is using to try and silence dissent and criticism of its actions, decisions and directions in other countries, including in Australia. So ASPI, for example, has just published a very detailed analysis of the United Front mechanism, the work department and the way it's implemented through various overseas Chinese associations. That is the same method and the same goal of silencing criticism of Beijing and stopping alternative systems of government being attractive to the mainland population. So there's some real commonalities between what's happening in Hong Kong and what's happening in the broader world as Beijing's power grows and as its confidence in coercing others and co-opting others grows. So again, this isn't just an issue for the people of Hong Kong and the people of mainland China. This is an issue for the international, the citizens of the world as well as the governments of the world.
And they may actually exclude foreign journalists from reporting on Hong Kong. And there's some people are now saying in Hong Kong, the pro-Beijing people are saying, why do we allow foreign judges to sit in our courts? Do you see that coming? They will insist the Chineseness of Hong Kong, which of course is an international city, and it should remain that way according to the Joint Declaration and the Basic Law.
Are you concerned, Alan and Martin, about the judicial independence angle? I mean, that has been a key factor in Hong Kong's vibrant financial status, the independence of the judiciary. How does that work under a Beijing-controlled Hong Kong?
Well, I shall deal with.
I think you're on mute.
I'm on.
Sorry, go ahead.
I shall deal with this
No, it's okay.
issue in a moment. But if I may just add a few words to what has fallen from Michael. I think the Hong Kong experience in dealing with the Chinese Communist Party is highly relevant and a case in point here for the free world to visualize how the CCP could infiltrate into social establishments and institutions of a liberal democracy. Hong Kong, I think, is beyond dispute to have been a member of liberal democratic world. We embrace the same core values, like we respect personal freedom, human rights, and we have a rule of law. And we do have some form of elections. Now, in the past 23 years, if you look at the Hong Kong experience, you can tell in exact manners how the CCP could rig our elections, could use terminologies in liberal democracies to actually destroy the core values and institutions of such an establishment and society. Now, this will be very good reference value to the free world when they continue to deal with the CCP. If you let Hong Kong fall, in my analysis, is that you are sending all the wrong messages to CCP. Like you are not standing up for a member of the liberal democratic world who embraces the same core values and institutions as you do. In Australia, in this case, when I'm talking to an Australian audience. And so you are sending a message to Beijing that it can get away with fouling the rules just as what it has done in the past 20 years after its accession to WTO. So that is really not a very wise thing to do. Then you may end up to be at the absolute mercy of this giant, this Goliath. You can actually picture yourself as another Hong Kong
in a similar situation.
So that's why I've been saying that today's Hong Kong, maybe your tomorrow, if you're doing nothing to avert the course that you are now on.
Let's talk about those global implications of Hong Kong, as you've raised, Alan. I mean, the US has threatened to revert or change its recognition of Hong Kong's status. I mean, Michael, how do you think the US will react if China goes ahead with dealing with this law? And following Michael, how do all of you think this will affect other countries in their approaches to Beijing? Michael, you're on. Yeah.
Yes. Well, look, I think we can see some of the reactions already. So we've seen an aligned joint statement from the UK, Canadian, Australian and US governments now, being very critical of Beijing's attempts to break the commitments it made in front of the world to the Hong Kong people and to the international community and other governments in 1984, and foreshadowing sanctions against Beijing decision makers and officials. And also, in the US case, talking about the consequences for the favourable economic treatment that Hong Kong has. My apologies, it's my phone, but I just let it go through. And so we can see that there are ideas about the kind of pressure that can be put on Beijing. And we can see the UK government foreshadowing paths to citizenship for the population of Hong Kong. Now, an equally interesting question is, and what more can we do and should we do? And I think this goes right to the heart of what Alan and Martin are saying about this is not over. It's Beijing's goal to make us all think this is a fait accompli, but that's not the case. Countries can put autonomous sanctions on Beijing officials and Hong Kong officials who pass and implement these new laws and explicitly breach the terms of the international commitment that Beijing made in 1984. Those countries with Magnitsky-style legislation can use that as a tool. Other countries with autonomous sanctions legislation can use that. We can do those things. We can join the UK in giving paths to citizenship for people of Hong Kong. And my view is that's a wonderful way of helping the Hong Kong people assert the freedoms that they are entitled to from the commitments Beijing made, because it lets them act more freely, knowing there's an alternative for them should Beijing's coercion become so violent and controlling that they need to leave. So we can do these more creative things. And I think Beijing knows that there are these tools available, which is why they're so keen to hurry and make it appear like a fait accompli.
Maya, what do you think, what action Hong Kongers would like to see from other countries?
I think Michael outlined a number of them, but I think that one thing is that the BNO scheme, the British National Overseas Scheme that is being proposed by the British government, falls short of, well, first of all, details, whether or not it would cost people to come, and also critically, young people who are at the front line of the protests are not, seems to be offered anything at this moment. So anything that would expand the protection to young protesters would be important. And in terms of targeted sanctions, we'd really like to see that beyond just rhetoric, because it seems to me that there is agreement that that would be needed, but we still have not seen any kind of targeted sanctions on any governments. And a banding together approach would be important as well. That I think increasingly what is happening in Hong Kong is being portrayed as this US-China fight for dominance, rather than saying, well, this is about values and democracy and human rights, and that democratic governments need to do work on it together. You see that narrative very pronounced now in Europe, particularly with Germany, that Germany says, oh, I don't want to be in between the US and China. How does one try to focus that debate on human rights, given the reality of Trump and his agenda is going to be also somewhat complicated. And finally, I think, I think there are a number of things that, other things that governments can do. The other thing is to support civil society. There's no doubt civil society space is going to be dramatically reduced. There are, like I said, pillars of freedoms like the internet. Like right now, there's still quite a lot of space free from surveillance. The media freedom, which I think the Hong Kong government is also very keen to reduce through licensing of journalists or talk of licensing of journalists. These are the areas where I think foreign governments can really be assertive in protecting. Observing trials, for example, of Martin's upcoming trial would be important. And then finally, I think governments need to have a greater strategy about China. I think that conversation is there because, and make that strategy, make the human rights a foundation of that strategy and craft all the other cooperation with China around it. Because we see a separation of human rights, a setting aside of human rights in the last 10 years with regard to China has led to a dramatic failure of really understanding the very essence of the Chinese Communist Party around the world. So we need a rethinking of that and a more systematic strategy rather than a piecemeal dealing with Hong Kong or Xinjiang. What do we say to that? That strategy is is long overdue.
Thanks, Maya. No, that's really interesting. Yes, Martin.
What we need is a long-term sustainability on Hong Kong. Now, I appreciate all different governments are now trying to help in different ways. I thank you for all these things. They're all helpful to Hong Kong. But we need a comprehensive policy for everybody to adhere to. China's tactic is very simple: divide and conquer. So when now you have the 4 foreign secretaries together, all right? China will make sure that others don't join you, like Germany and others. So you need to engage as many countries as possible. And the aim, of course, is to protect Hong Kong. Always concentrate on Hong Kong. If you just punish China, it may not be a bad thing, provided it leads to this overall policy on Hong Kong. And that policy can only be Deng Xiaoping's own policy, which he promised and was registered in the United Nations. That is the easy way to hold China to her own promises given to the whole world. That's the easiest thing to do. And you will be standing on the moral high ground. What can China say? Don't let China just walk away from it. And then we've got a new policy. You can't do that. You cannot obtain Hong Kong from the British government by way of this agreement and then walk away from it and replace your promise with a new tactic, a new policy. You cannot do that. So we need comprehensive and sustainable policy on Hong Kong. Back to that okay. One can be good. That's
No, I think you're bringing up a really fundamental point, which is what is an achievable objective for the international community. And an achievable objective is returning Beijing to meeting the commitments it made to the people of Hong Kong and to the international community and to the UK government in the 1984 Joint Declaration. Now, that is achievable because it really matters to every international relationship and every international commitment that Beijing has given already and will give in coming years. Because what is at stake here for Beijing is a deep issue of trust. If they're willing to breach these very clear binding commitments, in the case of Hong Kong, then how on earth can any other country, any other decision maker, any other company trust Beijing's commitments on any other matter? And trust is a rising currency across the globe in light of the pandemic. So it's becoming a more critical issue that people can trust Beijing. And this is a real test of whether we can or not.
Thanks, Michael. Alan, did you want to make one more comment before we open up questions?
Yes. In fact, I agree with both Martin and Michael when they said that there had to be a concerted effort, a joint effort, particularly amongst members of countries of the free world. You may or may not know that there are 2 recent initiatives that are moving in that exact direction. One is a joint statement promoted by the last governor, Lord Patten, which is now signed by over 900 different politicians from the 5 continents. And that is a very short statement, but the final paragraph, if I may just read it to you. If the international community cannot trust Beijing to keep its word when it comes to Hong Kong, people will be reluctant to take its word on other matters. Sympathetic governments must unite to say that this flagrant breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration cannot be tolerated. So this is one of the initiatives. The other initiative is that parliamentarians from 9 countries actually formed themselves into a group called International Parliamentary Alliance on China. Now, these efforts, I think, are in the right direction. The free world must see what is happening in Hong Kong to be a battle, if you like, between the democratic model and the China model, the so-called China model, promoted by Xi Jinping. And Hong Kong has been chosen by history and our time to be the battleground. So that is what is happening in Hong Kong. I don't see another interpretation of it. So if that is the case, then we all should know where we should be heading.
Thanks, Alan. All right, well, look, I might start pulling out some of the questions from the audience now. People are interested to know what Taiwan can learn and implement from China's recent assertiveness and belligerence in Hong Kong. Who would like to take that one?
Well, we know the coronavirus is hitting now, but there is another virus clearly coming from China, which I call the CCP 20. CCP is Chinese Communist Party, 2020. That's a particularly terrible virus. It is, in fact, programmed to spread first to Hong Kong, so it's only an epidemic, but it's programmed to spread to every corner of the earth. It's targeted against every nation in order to kill the soul of a nation by killing all the core values. And you see, Chinese people are now joining your parties, and they have their own agenda. So there are a lot of Chinese agents already going into different parties in the liberal democracies in the world. And one thing is you cannot send your own Chinese parliament to influence them. See? So it's one-way traffic. And you feel that with the Confucius institutions and all of that. You see, spies are coming into your country like that. That is why we have this Article 23 legislation in Hong Kong, which prohibits foreign political organizations from conducting political activities in Hong Kong. So they know that. They don't want you guys to come into Hong Kong, all right? And yet they send the agents to your country and join your political parties. So that virus is bound to spread if you don't stop it in Hong Kong.
Now, if I can jump in here too. So Taiwan is another demonstrator to the mainland population of China that there is a successful, free, vibrant alternative to rule by the Chinese Communist Party. So just as Hong Kong, to continue the virus analogy, Beijing fears the political contagion into mainland China of freedom from Hong Kong. And they also fear that same political contagion of freedom, democracy, and independent rule of law from Taiwan to mainland China. So if anyone thinks that Hong Kong is the last example of Beijing's coercive outreach, they're wrong, and they're wrong in two ways. One, the coercion and isolation of Taiwan is already ratcheting up. And as Martin has, I think, very eloquently set out, this same moves to co-opt politics, business leaders, former political leaders in other countries is eerily similar to what Beijing is doing within Taiwan and in a more overt way in Hong Kong. We can all learn from what's happening in Hong Kong. But one big thing that I think the rest of the world needs to learn about Taiwan, given this, is we must act now to reverse the isolation that Beijing is creating around Taiwan. And that means very practical things. It means official level contact, which is perfectly permissible under the various One China recognitions that governments, including Australia's, have given. And it also means supporting Taiwan's renewed participation and membership in a whole lot of international organisations. So it's time to act now to reverse the isolation, because we know what the Beijing plan is, and that is to kill the democratic state of Taiwan by assimilating it by force, presumably, into the mainland. Because with what they've done to Hong Kong, no one in their right mind could trust a commitment from Beijing about a one country, two systems model for Taiwan.
Thanks, Michael. There's a question from Michael Hutchison about between the signing of the Sino-British Joint Declaration and the 97 handover, Tiananmen happened. How much did the way the CCP interpreted the lessons of Tiananmen subsequently impact its commitment to one country, two systems. So I guess what is the party taken from Tiananmen to and how it's applying that to how it deals with Hong Kong?
Well, if I may.
Yeah.
Well, just to answer this question first, and then I just say a few words on Taiwan. I think the lesson taken by the CCP from the Tiananmen massacre is that it will get away with such behavior, right? Because the free world actually, not too long after the Tiananmen massacre, resumed its trade with China. And, well, to be followed, of course, by China's accession to WTO. So this may be a wrong lesson taken from the Tiananmen massacre by the CCP. Now, on Taiwan, if I may say this, I think Hong Kong has saved Taiwan from CCP domination. You may recall that Tsai Ing-wen, the incumbent president of Taiwan, fell far behind in popularity polls before Hong Kong went into this anti-extradition movement. But her popularity started to rocket as the Hong Kong anti-extradition movement, or the freedom movement, as I call it, progressed. And Tsai Ing-wen was using this banner to promote herself and her party. Today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan. Now, so you can see how Hong Kong can be a big alarm clock that can wake people up to the CCP threat and domination. And of course, you know that the Kuomintang candidate, Han Kuo-yu, right, recently was successfully unseated by the people of Kaohsiung by votes more numerous than when he was first returned as the mayor of Kaohsiung. Now, so the Hong Kong experience, this one amongst many Davids standing up against the same Goliath, can be very inspiring. And that is why I come back to what I started this webinar on. The Hong Kong experience is highly relevant to the free world. If you do not want to become Hong Kong in 5-10 years' time, and it is high time that we acted. Now, in saying so, I'm not saying that you are not engaging the CCP at all. Quite to the contrary, you can continue to engage the CCP and bring it back to a rules-based world order that the free world has always intended to do since supporting China's accession to WTO. It is not too late. I think we can still talk some sense into the CCP, because this is really a matter of survival for the CCP.
Thanks, Alan. Maya, did you want to make a point earlier? I saw you'd unmuted your microphone briefly. Did you want to jump in on either the Taiwan or another question?
I think, well, I'm happy to talk a little bit about the question that someone else posed, which is asking about whether or not, I think a number of people have posted and asked whether or not the Chinese government is spreading itself really thinly.
Yeah.
With multiple territorial disputes and violations in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and everywhere. I see that as also a very prevalent argument in Hong Kong, that I think people in Hong Kong are waiting for the party to, suffer its own kind of overreach. I fear that is somewhat of a wishful thinking. I think that has been the thinking many governments have, that somehow the Chinese government over time, either with engaging with Western governments or that it will suffer its own problems and that it will have to change. I think that kind of wishful thinking stop them from really coming up with a real strategy that works and that confronts some of the most aggressive actions by the Chinese government, including its United Front activities, which Alex Chowsky and ASPI has very eloquently outlined in his new report. I think the challenge is to not look away from these aggressions and say, this is a really serious threat. We're not going to be able to wait for it to be over. We have to take actions. And that also means that we have to think about the people inside China as real people rather than just agents of the Chinese government. Matt Pottinger of the US government has given a speech in Chinese talking about Chinese people's aspirations for freedom during the May 4th movement. I think that is important. We must treat people in China and outside of China as people who can think for themselves, and we have to speak to them and distinguish the party's institutions from the people, and that although some people are running for office in other countries with the party's agenda, they are people with affiliations to the United Front, not just ordinary Chinese people. And I think it's very important that the Chinese government is very clearly trying to discredit human rights and democracy everywhere, and is using the opportunity of the U.S. protests to do so. So how do we counter that kind of discrediting of human rights globally? I think governments have to really say, oh, human rights are important. They're not just window dressing, and we have to promote and defend human rights everywhere, including domestically. And that means, in Australia, that also means the rights of migrants. That these rights are important, not just when we are trying to counter government's influence. And I know this is a heavy lift because Human Rights Watch has been at it for many, many years, but nonetheless, I think we are having a serious assault on our values, which must be defended. So thank you.
Thank you, Maya. Yes, Martin.
Now, let's look at Tiananmen Square. It happened on the 4th of June 1989. The Basic Law was promulgated half a year later in April 1990. Deng Xiaoping was still very much worried about his own position so shortly after Tiananmen Square. And yet, when you look at the Basic Law, we were actually still given that high degree of autonomy in the Basic Law. There was no suggestion there that China would take it upon himself to pass this draconian law in the name of national security, right? Even at that time. Now China is already the world's second largest economy. So Xi Jinping says that China will be the most powerful country in the world in 5 years' time. So why is China now suddenly so concerned about the threat to its national security from little Hong Kong? How can anybody say that the skirmishes between the police and protesters would actually constitute a real danger to China's national security? Now, I agree with it. You cannot sit back and expect China to change. You cannot expect China to go back to Deng Xiaoping's way. China needs a little prompting from the international community. And if Germany doesn't want to join, these 4 countries, would persuade China to go back to Deng Xiaoping's way, at least Germany can play this role of a prompter. Because it is eminently in Xi Jinping's own interest. He wants to be the world's #1. If the world doesn't trust him, the world will gang up against him. It cannot be too expected of the development of China. So when Mr. Xi Jinping understands that, he and one person in China can bring the policy back to Deng Xiaoping's.
Yes.
Thanks, Martin.
I think Maya and Martin are right on target with this, because I think it's a mistake to think that China's internal challenges and contradictions will change Beijing's decision-making without external action and external involvement. And this is back to that point. I think Beijing might have learned the wrong lesson from Tiananmen Square, which is there were some sanctions and there were some actions, but people pretty much got back to business fairly quickly. This time, the pattern of distrust is now much greater, and the consequences of Beijing breaking commitments are much greater, and Beijing's intrusion and coercion into other states, including Australia's, is also obvious. So the environment is quite different to that at 1989. I think the world knows Beijing better, and the world sees the consequences of not acting more clearly. And even the most ruthless business person must be looking at the coercive and interventionist way that Beijing is acting against trade and business relations, and factoring in that as a risk of doing business with China. Now, all of that matters to Beijing, and all of that can change their calculations. So we need to take the right lessons out of Tiananmen, and we need to see that we are actors that can affect Beijing's calculations around Hong Kong.
Thanks, Michael. I see there's a question lots of people are interested in an answer to from Luan Hagen. How do we hold China accountable under a consistent multinational approach when many key countries have overlooked the CCP's assault on human rights in exchange for potential prosperity and growth? How should the response be framed or sold to other countries and their states or citizens?
Well, I think we could see with Hong Kong that human rights and freedom affect economics. There's a reason that Hong Kong has been the golden goose for the Chinese economy and for the world economy, and that is that the system of independent courts, freedom of speech, it releases that creativity that leads to prosperity. So there's a direct connection between freedom and independent courts and economic success. And back to my point I was just making about if you cannot rely on predictable justice to regulate business relationships, then you cannot invest with confidence and you cannot enter contracts with confidence. Now, all of that will undercut Beijing's economic relations with the rest of the world. And we can see coercing Australia around the barley trade and making noises about where its medical assistance would go, depending on government's attitudes to Beijing. These are all signals that that there's an unpredictability and a coercive element to dealing with China economically. And that is something that I think a lot of businesses and a lot of governments are now coming to terms with in a way they simply overlooked at the time of Tiananmen Square.
Alan.
I agree with Michael 100%. I think it is a point that is now generally accepted amongst the free world and also people doing business with China, that you can't just have your eyes on the profits that you are making in the huge Chinese market, because it is very dangerous to do business with a political power that does not respect freedom of expression, journalistic freedom, human rights, etc. And there's no rule of law in the true sense, in the sense that we know of it. And I think the COVID-19 pandemic really wakes people up to actually link economic success and liberal democratic values, institutions, and ideologies. In fact, we can go back to where we started by our support for China's accession to WTO. And that is where we are going back to, and holding China under CCP accountable. I think that is really a simple enough message to be sent to President Xi Jinping, that the world can still do business with you, provided that you respect institutions and core values and a rules-based world order, right? And I think that is really the thing. I'm just wondering whether I can answer the earlier question that I did not do at the time, which is the judiciary in Hong Kong. I just say a few words there. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mhm,
Now,
yeah.
of course, we know that our judiciary is no longer as autonomous and as independent as it was before 1997. Now, the first major inroad into our judiciary's autonomy is, of course, the National People's Congress Standing Committee interpretation of the Basic Law. And you all know that since 1997, there were 5 occasions on which the National People's Congress Standing Committee interpreted the Basic Law. And on 4 out of the 5 occasions, both Martin and I, joined by thousands of legal practitioners in Hong Kong, went out to march our streets in black to manifest our protest, because this NPC-SC interpretation is like constructing another tier of court above our Court of Final Appeal. But of course, it is I don't know whether it's a consolation or not, but so far, such an interpretation power is only exercised unconstitutionally in our analysis, not in accordance with the Basic Law design, only on occasions of constitutional importance, like whether you can have universal suffrage, etc. It hasn't eaten into purely commercial matter. So that is the only consolation. Now, and also, if I may just say this, the CCP way of restricting judicial discretion is a case in point here. I can actually bet you anything that this NPC-SC made national security law for Hong Kong would be set out and drafted in such a way that it would seriously restrict judicial discretion that can be exercised in hearing cases arising out of this law. But that is, of course, to assume that Hong Kong courts will still be given the power to adjudicate in these cases. But even then, I think by making laws in the PRC way, in the mainland way, our judges' discretion, a large part of it will be taken away.
Thanks, Alan. Now, I can see there's a few questions around, I guess, impacts on other countries, the ASEAN countries, for example. Somebody has asked, what are the ASEAN countries' stake in this? What options are available for them to respond to the CCP's aggression? Obviously, many of those nations are also dealing with border disputes with China, South China Sea issues. There was also a question about the economic impact on Australia and on Australia-China relations. Michael, would you like to weigh in on those points?
Yeah, something briefly about both. Well, I suppose everything we've been saying about Beijing's model of coercion and silencing that we see in Hong Kong and against Taiwan and in other countries is absolutely applicable to the members of ASEAN. So Beijing's offered compact to ASEAN is, you shut up and listen to our directions and imperatives, and in exchange, we will help you be prosperous by letting you engage with our economy. But this is a false compact because we've just been talking about The most assured path to human progress and prosperity is one involving personal freedom and independent courts. So it's a false model that they're being offered. But not supporting Hong Kong and not supporting Taiwan only puts them next in line for further coercion from Beijing. I think they know that, but they, like others, speak first. And as we saw with the international inquiry into the pandemic, a country like Australia being willing to speak first often brings a whole lot of others along. So it's really about the rest of us helping our Southeast Asian partners. Now, economic coercion. Well, we overthink this in some ways. We've seen some really naked economic coercion from Beijing on our barley trade, and even in recent days threatening any resumption of foreign students and tourists into our country. Threatening us to stop sending students to our country is almost amusing now because no one can come here for that purpose. But I think we have to think in two ways. One, Beijing has a weak economy and it needs inputs like Australia's resources and minerals. It will continue to buy those things simply because it needs them. But the other lesson is Beijing will use economics and trade more and more as a weapon. So if Australia and other countries double down and build more trade dependence on China, China is telling us they will use that as a weapon. Now, we need to take that seriously and think about how we shift our economies in the reset of the global economy that's happening post-pandemic.
Thanks, Michael. Maya, there's a question about the British offer of residency to a range of Hong Kong citizens. I think the question is, will there be sanctions or some type of retribution regarding the British government's providing citizenship? So I guess, will there be blowback from Beijing in London?
I think it's a little bit like what Michael just said. I think the Chinese government has wielded in the past economic power in order to punish and coerce governments to take its preference. On the other hand, curiously, I actually haven't seen any kind of concrete threats from China concerning BNO, the BNO offer. I mean, there is the threat, there are threats on HSBC, British Bank, that if the UK doesn't support Huawei's participation in 5G construction, there will be something that happens to HSBC. So now, I think the issue here, we haven't seen that kind of specific threats leveling at the offer of BNO yet. But the reality is that Beijing is willing to use these kind of threats. On the other hand, I think I would really be interested in seeing the research surrounding the economic impact of the Beijing's carrot and stick approach. We have heard of the Dalai Lama effects, but on the other hand, I think there is the importance of really distinguishing how much are we losing? Is any of these governments really losing from a particular policy position concerning China? How much are you actually gaining, and who is gaining from these kind of investment deals with China? I suspect that some of these gains are very limited to specific, very big companies. So Germany, for example, is particularly beholden because Volkswagen has a very large presence in China, and it is not able to quickly extricate itself. So having a long-term strategy of reducing economic dependence would be important for all the governments concerned about their relationship with China, because it's not something that you can just do like today. You have to plan ahead for 10 years. Coming back to why we need a strategic review of relationships with the Chinese government, with human rights at its center.
Thanks, Maya. That's really interesting. I think, the fear of punishment from China seems often a lot more outsized than the actual impacts. We're going to have to finish soon. I can see Martin and Michael, perhaps if we just have a couple of minutes each to close, because we're going to need to finish up in a few minutes. Martin.
Well, on the BNO, I think China has a point, because when they signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration, there was an exchange of memoranda, and the British government agreed that the BNO is not a passport, but only a traveling document. But what is interesting is now that China is complaining breach of this international agreement, I think the matter should be really adjudicated upon by the International Court of Justice. The British government has a good point, but you are walking away from it by this white paper approach. And China would say, but you are also in breach of this exchange of memoranda. Okay, so let the International Court of Justice determine all that. But I would like to say one important thing. We don't want to get the rest of the world to fight with China because it doesn't help Hong Kong. The rest of the world should actually give an option to China. We would like you to come back to the international community, and this is what the Joint Declaration is all about, rather than to fight you over Hong Kong. So that, I hope Mr. Xi Jinping will see the way. This is the best way forward for China, so that China can become part of the international community, playing this rule-based game, rather than to go off on a tangent of its own.
Thank you, Martin. Michael, would you like a quick final word?
Oh, well, just very quick. I think that's actually a wonderful note from Martin there, that calling on Beijing to meet the commitments that they've made to Hong Kong and the world is hardly a confrontational thing. I'm reminded of that saying from Ronald Reagan, trust but verify. So we don't want words from Beijing. We want actions that show they understand that their credibility internationally into the future is at stake with everything they do now on Hong Kong, and that there's a path they can take to rebuild international trust in China, and that will be to Beijing and the Chinese people's benefit, as well as to the people of Hong Kong and the rest of us. But I think without international action in some of the ways we've talked about today, Xi will take the path of struggle and we will all suffer, including his own people. So we must commit to the alternative that we've discussed here today.
Thanks, Michael. And Alan, brief last words to you. Would you like to say anything to finish up?
Yeah, thank you. Besides my emphasis on the relevance of Hong Kong to the free world's continued dealings with China under CCP, if I may also highlight this fact that back in 1986, at the time when the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed, the free world, leading countries of the free world, came out in support of it. And that document was also registered with the United Nations. But as we all know, the United Nations mechanism would need a sovereign state to start complaining against another sovereign state. And the only sovereign state that is able to do so in so far as the Sino-British Joint Declaration is concerned is the UK. Now, so the UK may actually try to think about ways of taking the Sino-British Joint Declaration to an international forum. Now, the International Court of Justice that Martin just mentioned may be a way forward. I'm no expert in that, but that is maybe a way to go. So far as my limited experience is concerned, I recall that the United Nations can actually send special envoys to particular country to police compliance with some international treaties or UN resolution. Human rights rapporteurs, whom I actually met in Hong Kong during my days as a politician here, they may also be relevant personnel in this connection. So I think, yes, Hong Kong is quite ready and prepared to share our experience in dealing with the CCP with the free world. And I hope the free world will continue to focus on us as one of the many Davids facing up to the same Goliath. Our experience is highly relevant and can be inspiring. And let us not forget that it really comes down to whether you cherish the freedom and also human rights protected by an efficient and effective rule of law institution. If you do, then Hong Kong cannot, you cannot lose Hong Kong. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Look, fascinating discussion today, everyone. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone who joined us. It's been great.